And good morning, everyone. If you are new, my name is Sharon. I'm one of the pastors here at Bright City. And I am curious, who in here has seen the movie The Odyssey? Okay, a good bit of people. It's kind of hard to see. I can see hands. So Ike and I, we actually came here to the AMC a couple weeks ago to see The Odyssey. And I need you guys to be really proud of me because I am a big baby when it comes to violence. And so I tend to avoid like any movie that's rated R for violence. I am like out on that. And so Ike is always having to watch these movies when I go out of town. But I had heard that this was one of Christopher Nolan's best movies ever. I'm sure this is debatable, but was hearing really, really great things about this movie and that it was also really shot to be seen in the movie theater. And so I didn't want to miss out. I was having major FOMO. And so I thought, I'm gonna put my big girl pants on and I'm gonna go see this movie. And I also researched it just to know like where are the especially violent parts where I can be prepared. And then we came and I came in with a strategy, which is that first of all, we sat on the very back row. So we were as far away from the screen as possible. And then during the fight scenes specifically, what I did is I squinted my eyes. And this is like, I'm recommending this to any of you who are big chickens like me. And so this allowed me to see enough of the action that I could see what was going on without all of the like gruesome details. And so Ike's sitting next to me, probably watching me just go like this, for a good part of the movie. But I will tell you, it worked really well. And so if you don't like violence like me, I recommend this strategy. I will say this movie is not for children, so please do not take your children. But if you are an adult, this is a good strategy. And I'm really glad that we did go and see The Odyssey because it was a really good movie. And one of the ways that I kind of measure the quality of a movie is whether or not I find myself thinking about it later, where I'm kind of turning different aspects of it over in my mind or asking questions or wanting to go back and see it again so that I can see this one part from this different perspective. And this was definitely that kind of movie where afterwards I was thinking about it a lot. And one of the things that I really liked about this movie is that Christopher Nolan, he is faithful to the original, but he also departs from it. And I want to say right now, because prior to the service, Ike and I were informed that we are, quote, really bad about spoiling movies. So shots fired, but I was very, very intentional. I'm not spoiling any movies, but one thing that he does is sort of play with this concept of the involvement of the gods. Because if you have read the original book, you know that the gods are very involved in Odysseus' journey. In fact, the book opens with this council of the gods, where the gods are meeting and they're talking about what to do about Odysseus. And so they have a good bit of control over his fate. But in the movie version, Odysseus has a lot more agency in his own story. And one of the ways that you see this contrast actually most prominently is at the very beginning of the movie. As I mentioned in the book, it starts out with this council of the gods, but at the very beginning of the movie, you have this screen, this black screen with just this statement that all it says is a time of apparent magic. And this word apparent, what Nolan is doing there is sort of planting this seed of doubt, where he's kind of raising this question of, is anything that you're about to see related to magic, related to the supernatural, related to the gods, is it real? Did it really happen as the story has been told? And I really like that he toys with this idea. He plays with this idea because I think that is a question that we can all relate to. In the same way that Odysseus is on this 20-year wilderness journey, that's really what the Odyssey is about. And we're left to question, are the gods involved? Are the gods even real? I think we can relate to that when we were in our own wilderness journeys. Where is God? What exactly is God's role in all of this? Is God even here at all? How does he meet us? And so this morning, that's actually the question that I want to answer. We're going to turn to another story of someone who finds themselves in the wilderness and how God meets them there. But also what this means for us. Because up until now, we have mostly, in this series, Summer in the Sand, we've mostly looked at how the wilderness affects us. How it causes us to ask questions, how it causes us to wrestle with doubt, also how it forms us, how it forms our character, how it forms our calling. But what we have spent less time looking at is, what is God's role? Where is he? How does he meet us? And so we're going to answer that question by looking this morning at the story of Elijah. And it's been a couple years since I have actually taught on Elijah. The last time I taught on Elijah was in our study of silence and solitude, the spiritual discipline of silence and solitude. And that's the last time I really gave context to who this prophet is. And so I wanted, before we dive into this story about a man in the wilderness and how God meets him there, I want to give you a little bit of a refresher if you need a refresher for Elijah, or maybe you don't know anything about Elijah at all. Here is just a little bit of context. I'm going to pop up on the screen a timeline of where we find Elijah in the history of the Old Testament and the broader arc of Scripture. One thing that you will notice is that he lived approximately 900 years prior to the birth of Jesus. So that's where we are in relation to Jesus. But what we also see is that he lived just after the split of the kingdom of Israel. This is something that we often forget when we think about the Old Testament and Israel. We tend to think of Israel as this one thing that just exists throughout the Old Testament. And we forget that actually after David, the kingdom of Israel splits into two. You have the northern kingdom that continues to be called Israel, and then the southern kingdom that is called Judah. And this is one of the reasons why I personally find all the different kings and prophets in the Old Testament a little bit confusing, because you have two different timelines happening after that split. And so you've got these kings and prophets in the northern kingdom, and you've got kings and prophets in the southern kingdom. And so Elijah is in the northern kingdom. That's when he is leading and is prophesying. And while Elijah is doing this work, the king of the northern kingdom at the time is a man named Ahab. And Ahab is an ungodly, wicked king. Because what Ahab does is he marries a foreign woman named Jezebel, who influenced God's people to worship another god named Baal. And so because of this, Ahab, with his wife Jezebel, they end up overseeing the persecution of God's own prophets. In fact, Jezebel sought to eradicate God's prophets. And so this is the backdrop against which Elijah is on the scene. He is vocally opposing them. He is opposing the prophets of Baal. There's a famous story where he faces off against the prophets of Baal. He humiliates them, then he has them executed. And Ahab and Jezebel, they hear about all this work that Elijah is doing, and they are angry. That is the backdrop that we have behind us as we go into 1 Kings chapter 19, which I'm going to read now. So this is what it says. It says, Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "May the gods punish me and do so severely if I don't make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then Elijah became afraid and immediately ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba that belonged to Judah, he left his servant there, but he went on a day's journey into the wilderness. He sat down under a broom tree and prayed that he might die. He said, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down and slept under the broom tree. So just to recap what we have just seen, Elijah, this great prophet who has overseen all these different miracles, he's in this moment where he needs great faith. He needs great trust in God. And is that what we see in Elijah? No. We see the opposite. We see him collapse in fear. He falls apart. He wants to quit. And the last time I taught on Elijah, I mentioned this as well, but this response has always been so interesting to me because up until this moment, Elijah has only experienced success. As I mentioned, he oversees the humiliation, this public humiliation of the prophets of Baal. It's this huge validation of the power of God. He raises someone from the dead. It's as if everything that Elijah touches turns to gold. His whole ministry is up and to the right. And then at the first sign of opposition, you think this is the moment where he's been building his faith to trust God for this very moment. Instead, he falls apart. He wants to give up. He is even to the point of wanting to die. Now, I have read this story a bajillion times. And one of the reasons why I come to this story again and again and again and again is that what I think this story is really about is that it is a picture actually of leadership burnout. And the reason why I think that is that even though things have been going well for Elijah up until this point, things have also been going at a breakneck pace and in a very short period of time. So everything that I just listed, and that's not even everything, but everything that I just listed happens in a 3-year period. And so that is a lot. And the fact that he's reached this point where his reaction is not to trust God, not to respond in faith, to believe that maybe God could show up with another miracle. The fact that instead his response is a desire for escape. Well, escape is actually a classic sign of burnout. If you find yourself in your job daydreaming about escape, it could be that your job is really boring, but it's also possible that you are wrestling with burnout yourself. I think this is a picture of a man who is just worn out. And so he can't cope with this recent test of faith because the well is dry. He has no more emotional reserves to draw from. And because of this burnout, we see in Elijah something that we have talked about a lot through this series. One of the reasons we wanted to look at so many different stories of being in the wilderness is you start to see these patterns of things that people do over and over and over again, because this is just how humans respond in the wilderness. And what we see here in Elijah is distorted thinking. Elijah is not seeing clearly because he goes to God and he says, I'm the only one left. And we know from the chapter prior and what we'll see by the end of this chapter is that is simply not true. There are thousands of faithful Israelites left. There are hundreds of faithful prophets left. And so it's an emotional truth, not a factual one. But all of that to say, what we see in this moment is Elijah is not in a good place. He is burned out. He is daydreaming about escape. Psychologically, he feels very alone, even though he is not actually alone. And so he is throwing a pretty dramatic pity party in this moment. And when he flees into the wilderness, even though he's in the literal wilderness, that literal wilderness is kind of a picture of what's happening internally. There's an internal wilderness inside of Elijah as well. And so he gets into the wilderness, and this is one story. We've not seen God respond as much in the other stories that we've looked at so far, but this is one story where God is very, very active. And how does God respond to Elijah? Does he respond by scolding him for his lack of faith? Does he rebuke his self-righteousness? I mean, what a bold thing to say. I'm the only one left who is faithful. Does he chastise him? You have seen me, Elijah, do all these miracles. How could you doubt me now? No. God does not do any of those things. Instead, this is what God does. In verse 6, it says, suddenly, an angel touched him. The angel told him, get up and eat. Then he looked, and there at his head was a loaf of bread baked over hot stones and a jug of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. God feeds him, gives him water, and gives him space to rest. All of which leads to the first way that God meets us in the wilderness, which is with tenderness. We see this in so many wilderness stories in the Bible. When the Israelites enter the wilderness, God feeds them. When Jacob flees from Esau into the wilderness, God appears to him in a dream and basically says to him, everything is going to be okay. Even when Jonah flees to the wilderness after preaching to Nineveh and he's being very, very petty, God still gives him this little plant for shade. God shows tenderness again and again and again. And amazingly, this is what I especially want you to know. He does this regardless of the circumstances. He shows tenderness when people are being mistreated, when they are suffering from injustice. But he even shows tenderness when they are the cause. When it was their bad decision-making that led to the wilderness in the first place, God still meets them with tenderness. And this is a powerful reminder that when we are in the wilderness ourselves, that God meets us with tenderness as well. That we don't have to worry, even if we are the cause, we're the reason why we are in the wilderness. We don't have to worry that we're going to be met with a God who's going to say, I told you so. I told you you shouldn't have done that. He's not going to kick you when you are already down. And I don't know about you, but this is something that I actually struggled with for quite a long time when I was going through my own wilderness seasons. And, when you're suffering, when you're in grief, you sort of hope that in those moments you're going to rise to the occasion and you're going to have this response of obedience and great trust. But I'll be honest with you, there have been times when that was not my response at all. I would describe my response as much more pathetic, honestly. And in those moments, it's so cruel that we do this to ourselves because you take pain and then you put shame on top of it. Because you think, I should have responded with more faith. I should have responded with more trust. And then you start to think, in your pain, I must have disappointed God. God must be so disappointed in me that I'm not suffering better. And so if you have wrestled with those feelings as well, that you're not handling the wilderness as well as you would have liked, I want you to know that you don't have to apologize to God for your feelings before you can go to him. That's not what we see here. Instead, God always responds in gentleness, compassion, and great care. The story reminds me of a meme that you may have seen before. I'm going to pop this up on the screen. I'm sorry for what I said when I was hungry. Elijah is the picture of this meme and this story because Elijah is having a full-on existential crisis, and he is questioning the very goodness of God, when it turns out all he really needed was a snack and a nap. And what we see here is that God knows this, that he knows Elijah is human, and so he attends to Elijah's human needs. And I'll also say, just as a side note, as a parent, I find this to be incredibly convicting, but also has really shaped how I respond to my own kids. Because if you have been around any small children, you understand that their moods are highly determined by whether or not they are hungry or tired. And so I have been on the receiving end of some pretty scorching accusations. And in that moment, do I respond to my child by saying, "How dare you? I grew you in my stomach for 9 months and then gave birth to you. I went through the valley of the shadow of death to bring you into this world for you to speak to me this way?" No, I don't respond that way because I know that they just need like a pudding cup. That's not really how they feel. They actually need me to care for them, to attend to their needs in this moment. And I want you to know that that is how your Father in heaven feels about you. That you can go to him even when you are not your best self, when you are your worst self, knowing that he won't scold you for your lack of faith. He simply wants to take care of you, to show you love and care. And so that's exactly what he does, even though Elijah's being super ridiculous in this moment. He feeds him, he takes care of him, he lets him rest. But that is not the only way that God meets Elijah in the wilderness. As we continue, verse 7, it says, "Then the angel of the Lord returned for a second time and touched him. He said, 'Get up and eat, or the journey will be too much for you.' So he got up, ate, and drank. Then on the strength from that food, he walked 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. He entered a cave there and spent the night." So as I mentioned, I've read this story so many times. This is one of my go-to stories that I reflect on and pray over and study. And there's something that I just read that I'd actually missed many, many times. It wasn't until very recently that I noticed it. So first of all, Elijah, he flees to the wilderness in order to escape. He's just wanting to get away from it all. That's basically all that he is looking for. And God gives him exactly that. But then after he eats, after he sleeps, and he wakes up, this angel comes to Elijah and he says, "Hey, while you're here, we are actually going to go even deeper into the wilderness than you thought. And so you need to eat a little bit more because we are going on a 40-day journey." All of which leads to the second way that God meets us in the wilderness is actually by drawing us deeper into it. A lot of wilderness stories in the Bible are stories like this one. They are stories of escape. That is how they begin. People are just trying to get away from someone or something. Hagar, for example, she flees into the wilderness to get away from Sarah. Jacob flees into the wilderness to get away from Esau. Moses, as a young man, he flees into the wilderness to get away from the consequences of murdering an Egyptian. The Israelites flee into the wilderness to get away from Pharaoh. And here in this story, Elijah flees into the wilderness to get away from Jezebel and Ahab. in all of these stories, we have kind of different things that they are fleeing from. Some are fleeing toxic environments or real physical threats, while others are fleeing messes of their own making. But all of them, really all they're trying to do is just distance themselves from the situation. That's about it. There's no longer term thinking than that. However, in every single one of these examples that I just listed, when God shows up, when he meets them in the wilderness, it is not to take them out of it. When he meets them in the wilderness, it is to take them deeper into it. But more specifically, deeper into him. Now, why is it this way? Why are these stories so consistent? Why is he consistently drawing people deeper into the wilderness instead of fixing it, instead of just drawing them out? And the reason is that while escape is about neutralizing the problem or simply distancing ourselves from it, God wants to do more. What God wants to do is to transform escape into encounter so that he can do a deeper work in us. He wants to illuminate anything in ourselves that we need to see. He wants to heal anything that needs to be healed. And that just isn't a quick fix. It takes attention. It takes time. Now, practically speaking, what does this mean for us? Because the fact of the matter is, when we're in the wilderness, we have two options. Even though I'm telling you what God wants to do, he wants to turn escape into encounter. He wants to dig deeper into what is really going on inside of you. But we have a choice. We can still choose escape. So when we are in the wilderness, we can numb with alcohol or shopping or watching TV. We can blame others. Instead of searching ourselves, we can just put it on someone else. We can cut off relationship instead of having hard conversations. We can become bitter and guarded and cynical so that we don't get disappointed again. That is a form of escape from your own vulnerability. We can do that. We can cope with the wilderness through this short-term thinking of escape, or we can journey deeper into it so that we can encounter God there. We can practice Sabbath, silence, solitude, listening prayer to let God search us. We can let down our guard to let other people see us, what's really going on inside of us, to allow ourselves to actually be known at church, where you're not just coming in and leaving and barely talking to anyone. You're here once a month. No one really knows you. You can finally let people in, or maybe you could go to therapy or practice confession or ask for help. You can forgive. You can repent. I don't know what deeper looks like for you in your current wilderness season, but what I do know is that God is inviting us to abandon the temporary solution of escape because there is no healing there. And so what he's inviting us to do is to exchange our escape for transformational encounter. That's the second way that he meets us. And then the third comes to us in the final portion of this passage, which I'm going to actually just read straight through. And as I read this, what I want you to do is I want you to pay attention to what Elijah says. This story is so interesting and a little bit unique as a wilderness story because we don't hear a lot from Elijah. He only speaks 3 times in the story, twice in the passage I'm about to read. But I want you to pay attention to what you hear Elijah saying. So it says, suddenly the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord God of armies, but the Israelites have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are looking for me to take my life. Then God said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the Lord's presence." At that moment, the Lord passed by. A great and mighty wind was tearing at the mountains and was shattering cliffs before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was a voice, a soft whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came to him and again said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of armies," he replied, "but the Israelites have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they're looking for me to take my life." And then the Lord said to him, and I can't help but wonder if he says this almost with kind of a sigh, "Go and return by the way you came to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you are to anoint Hazael as king over Aram. You are to anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel, and Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Meholah, as prophet in your place. Then Jehu will put to death whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death whoever escapes the sword of Jehu. But I will leave 7,000 in Israel, every knee that has not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." I love how God sort of bookends with this BTW, you are not the only faithful one left. There are 7,000. Now, as I mentioned in this story, Elijah, he only speaks 3 times. And I don't know if you noticed this, but each time he only talks about one thing, and that is himself. He talks about how much more faithful he is than everyone else. In fact, he's the only one who has remained faithful. And now Ahab and Jezebel are trying to kill him. And so he's sort of implying that I know why you brought me out here, because I'm the last hope of Israel. That's why you brought me out here. But he also can't bear up under the pressure of all of this, which is why he is despairing. And so that is what Elijah says. But I want you to pay attention to what is happening around him as he says these things. As I already mentioned, prior to fleeing into the wilderness, Elijah has witnessed miracle after miracle after miracle. Somehow that is not enough to buttress him. And so he flees into the wilderness. He collapses in despair. "You might as well take my life, Lord." Then God sends an angel to feed him. Then the angel leads him to Mount Horeb, which is also known as Mount Sinai. This is the place where Moses received the 10 Commandments, this history-shifting event. He brings him here to the site of where it all began, this monument of God's faithfulness, and says to him, "Elijah, why do you think you are here?" And Elijah misses the significance of this place and says again, "To spare me, because I am the only hope of Israel. You're keeping me safe. It all hinges on me." And so then God keeps going. He literally reenacts what happened on that mountain with the wind and the fire and the earthquake. This is what happened when Moses received the 10 Commandments. And then again, he says, "Elijah, why do you think you are here?" And Elijah still doesn't get it. He repeats, I don't know if you noticed this, he said exactly the same thing he said before. "I'm here because I'm the only one left. It all hinges on me." After which, God seems to acknowledge that Elijah is not going to let go of this script. He is tired and he doesn't want to listen. And so God appoints Elisha to take his place. He gives Elijah exactly what he wants in the end. But what we see here is that it doesn't matter what Elijah sees or experiences in the wilderness, because he is married to this script in which he is the victim and nobody understands him and everything rests on his shoulders. No matter what happens to the contrary, he seems bent on seeing his story, his life, this very particular way, all of which is to say, everything is run through the lens of self. This is, and this is kind of a cautionary tale for us, this is a great temptation in the wilderness for our vision to become small and self-ward, because we're kind of in survival mode. And so we're focusing on how things affect us, how no one understands us, how no one cares about us. And to some extent, and I gotta credit Abby Thomas to pointing this out to me in preaching group, because I didn't even think about this, but to some extent, we should be encouraged that Elijah, he's one of the greatest of all the prophets, and still he is succumbing to this temptation. This man who saw so many miracles, and yet this self-focused mentality has this grip on his psyche. It is tough to break. And yet what we can see here is that the very thing that God was inviting him to do was to let go of it, to look up, to widen his gaze, to expand his vision. Remember that he is part of a larger story. By bringing Elijah to this place where it all began, but also pointing him to the people that are coming after him, it's reminding him this story began long before you and it will continue without you. This does not, in fact, rest on your shoulders. This story is not even about you. All of which leads us to the third and final way that God meets us in the wilderness, which is by drawing us out of ourselves. Now, I want to say that the order of these things is so important that it starts with tenderness and then drawing us deeper into himself in the wilderness to look at what's really going on inside of us. He doesn't start by rebuking Elijah's narcissism. That is not where he begins. And instead, he attends to his physical needs, his emotional needs, and only then does he gently pull Elijah's gaze back toward his higher purpose, reminding them that he was created for more than life in a cave. But unfortunately, what we see in this story is that Elijah never really seems to get it. He is stuck on this script. And because of this life that was so remarkable, so defined by miracles, we see for the next several chapters, not much happens until his death. He has a truly miraculous death, but it almost sort of goes down after that. And so as I said, this story of how God meets Elijah in the wilderness, it is a story of God's great tenderness to us. But it is also a cautionary tale of the ways that we can get lost in our own pain. And so we remember this story to remind ourselves that we don't have to be like Elijah. We can let God care for us. We can let God draw us deeper into himself to see what we need to see. But then, at some point, we can also raise our eyes again to be recommissioned into this higher purpose that we were created for. Of course, as we close out this morning and remember that we don't have to live like Elijah, I also want to circle back to that opening story of Odysseus, because what this story also reminds us is that we don't have to live like Odysseus either. We are not actually the masters of our own fate. We don't have to figure it all out on our own, but more importantly, we don't have to wonder where God is in the wilderness. Because in addition to the many ways that God meets us in the wilderness, as we saw here, so tenderly, so carefully, we also know that the most important way that God has met us in the wilderness is through Christ. That through his birth, his life, his death on the cross, Jesus came to live every wilderness that we will ever live, so that when we put our trust in him, we know that we will never walk the wilderness without him. And so in just a moment, we are going to take communion together, an act of remembering Jesus' own wilderness experience and his solidarity with our own. But first, I want to just give you a few moments to reflect, to listen. Where is God meeting you in your wilderness right now? Is he just wanting to be tender to you? Is he wanting to draw you deeper? Or maybe he is wanting you to look up again. Let's take a few moments to reflect.